Good morning. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Baute, Executive Vice President, General Manager at POLITICO, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by Avik, the President and CEO of Capital Power. Hey, Avik. How you
Callie,
doing?
I'm great. Nice to be here.
Capital Power operates a broad portfolio of power generation facilities across both Canada and the United States with a focus on delivering reliable, low-carbon energy to communities and industries. Today, we're going to explore how the company's navigating cross-border energy expansion, rising electricity demand, the evolving role of technology and policy on the future of power. Let's dive in, because that's a lot to tackle in just a short amount of time. So we've heard some consensus this morning that a diversified portfolio is going to be critical to addressing mounting energy demands. But where we've heard less consensus is the best way to achieve that. So Avik, to start, what are the right ingredients in the recipe for a low-carbon future?
Thanks, Callie. When we think about the grid, and if I roll back the clock before the pandemic, if at any point in time in the last 20 years we talked about energy demand, in particular in the US, we would have said aging demographic, declining GDP growth, growing energy efficiency, and that box of that electricity stack or the supply was really being driven by displacement of thermal, so old gas and retiring coal, by renewables at a 2-to-1, 3-to-1 pace. So the electricity stack or the supply stack, we had an electricity system that overall in the US and in Canada that provided dispatchable firm capacity and enough generation capacity to meet the peak versus trough demand overall. So as a result, we had a relatively stable grid. And that was all types of energy, but dramatically increasing and leveraging towards renewables. What's changed post-pandemic is, and a number of speakers have talked about this before already, is that we now have growing electrification. We have GDP growth. We have industrial reshoring. And we have growing electricity demand just from increased residential use, as John said before. And that's all before I even mentioned the letters AI. And so that's fundamentally changed the supply box that we're operating in, which is why we need to take an all-of-the-above approach. But more specifically, what we found, and we are the only public company that's an independent power producer that operates on both sides of the border and has consistently invested in gas. And what we've seen across electricity markets is that somewhere between 55% and 70% of any supply stack for an electricity system has to be dispatchable and firm. That number goes up and down depending on how much your peak versus trough demand is. So that firm supply has to come from, historically it's been coal, it can come from nuclear, it can come from natural gas, or it can come from hydro. Those are the only sources for firm demand. And so that's why, as we look forward, renewables, including batteries, but essentially a doubling down on natural gas, where we have short to medium term demand that has to be made. And why natural gas? Because we have the infrastructure in place for it. The marginal cost for new capacity is the lowest amongst major source of electricity or large loads. And then secondly, I would say, 20% of the generation in the US is underutilized. It's mostly gas. So there's 20% of the capacity that's running for less than 100 hours a year. That capacity has a grid interconnect. That capacity has gas supply coming into it. And so if we can't improve utilization of that capacity, how are we going to go build new generation capacity?
So a lot of companies are talking about and touting lower carbon solutions, but without providing a lot of specificity behind what that means. Do you have any case studies or examples that you can share from Capital Power that showcase some of these solutions at work?
Yeah, and look, we made the difficult decision last year to remove our net zero target for 2045. And fundamentally, it was because of what I just described. Our business was focused on retiring existing generation and replacing it with lower carbon generation. Our company over a decade ago was 2/3 coal. Today, we're zero. And so one of the projects we're most proud of is we took a 100% coal-fired power plant and converted it to natural gas. That plant went on stream in December of last year, and it's now the most efficient gas-fired plant in all of Canada at a sub-7 heat rate. On top of that, we've been at the forefront of looking at carbon capture and sequestration on that same plant. So technically, we've validated that technology, but economically, we haven't been able to underwrite it or FID it just because of the cost and not having a firm carbon policy in place in Canada to underwrite it. But I think those two things in particular, repowering coal to gas, repowering old inefficient gas plants into highly efficient gas plants, and then looking at carbon capture and sequestration. And then, as John said in the earlier chat, batteries and the role batteries plays with peakers in managing load over time is also a decarbonization event.
One of the things that also came up in the last conversation was data centers that seem to be popping up everywhere. What's causing the sudden boom, and what sort of energy solutions will be required long-term to power these behemoth facilities and ultimately sustain that innovation?
I've been focused on energy transition since 2010, and I firmly believed and drank the Kool-Aid around what distributed generation could do to transform the energy system. Similarly, I firmly believed that in order to decarbonize, we needed a global carbon taxonomy. And lo and behold, neither of those two things have transpired for different reasons. Some geopolitical, some economic, some just overall system constraints. So as we look forward, when we look at AI and data centers, they're very large loads. So I think the gentleman this morning said, the city of Seattle. Well, 1,000 megawatt data center is about 1 million square feet. And that 1 million square feet could hold somewhere around 500,000 NVIDIA chips for those that are counting. That is the equivalent of powering call it a 1.2 million person city. And so in terms of system design, what we have to have a fundamental conversation around in this country, as well as Canada, is how do we incorporate these large loads where the system wasn't designed to manage them? We have a century's worth of infrastructure that was built around this hub and spoke model. Build really large plants, build spokes and nodes out to where the demand is, and then all of that infrastructure is shared costs borne by the ratepayer. Well, what's happened in the last 15 years is that as we've built out renewables quite aggressively at 2-to-1, 3-to-1 per megawatt relative to what we're retiring, we've had to connect each one of those renewable projects, and they've been smaller capacity. But the cost to connect it is the same whether it's operating 20% of the time, 40% of the time, or 100% of the time. So as a result, each one of us who are consumers, we look at our utility bill every month, and what do we see? We see half to 2/3 of the charges as shared costs, not the actual power we're consuming. And so as we start talking about AI and data centers, that's the discussion we need to have, which is from a system perspective, like there's 3 legs to the stool here. There's the regulators and the policymakers. There's industry, which is players like the utilities and ourselves. And then there's the off-takers. Well, if one of those legs is wobbly, then the whole thing falls over. And the question in front of us today is, how do we bring in large load, because it's a national security issue, there's an arms race for AI, without compromising reliability and affordability to ratepayers, but then also accommodating the medium to long-term demand growth and supply that's required. And that's going to require solutions that are taking the best and optimizing what we have, whether it's gas, whether it's keeping coal on for a little bit longer, or whether it's incenting large-scale investment in dispatchable generation. But it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. You can't take 1,000 megawatts of dispatchable off the grid and go behind the fence for a data center. You need to be able to work with utilities and regulators and map out a ramp schedule that accommodates the fact that we need that capacity to process and teach these learning models today. But then those those load-serving entities need medium to long-term capacity over time as well.
One of the things, though, that has been concerning for a lot of folks about data centers is the supply chain and environmental impact that they have. Let's talk about two of the legs of that stool that you just mentioned. How is industry working with policymakers to address some of these concerns, or what do you need from policymakers to address yet continue to create expansion opportunities?
Well, so this ends up becoming an RTO level or state level conversation. And what we're trying to do is marry two separate objectives. And so from a utility or load serving perspective, they file their integrated resource plan, they look at medium to long-term demand, and then they match that with a supply forecast to bring in new demand that ratepayers pay for. The hyperscalers, who have this existential need for power to process and teach these language learning models, need power today, have capital, and have very strict decarbonization objectives as well. And so at a state level, what we need is, how do we accommodate? In many places, we've put policies in place over the last 15 years with the primary objective being decarbonization or meeting net zero, without recognizing that we may have incremental demand that we never assumed when we designed those policies. So how do we introduce glide paths today without necessarily compromising those policy objectives? So, for example, in Michigan with the clean energy plan, there's a decarbonization objective around 2035. Well, if Michigan wants to lead on AI and data centers, there's discussion around a new semiconductor plant being put in Michigan. Well, we need thousands of megawatts of new power there. And that will have to come in a timeline that requires new natural gas. But I can't build new natural gas without having carbon capture and sequestration attached to it today. But we're not there today. So if I don't build the new gas, I can't add CCS onto it, and it pushes all of those timelines out. And so that's an example of where we've got to come together and determine at a state level, what adjustments or accommodations can we make to the policy objective to allow for the investment to meet the needs of that state.
All right, we have time for one more question before we get the hook here. Your company has cross-continental footprint with major operations out of Phoenix, Edmonton, go Oilers, Calgary, Alberta, and many other locations. So what are some of the key differences in how the US and Canada are navigating the energy demand crisis, and what learnings do you think we should apply here in the US?
What's interesting is we face many of the same challenges on both sides of the border. We have a highly integrated economy between our two countries. There's $1 trillion of trade, 700 billion of it is energy related, and our grids are interconnected. What's interesting is on both sides of the border, we have all types of electricity systems and market structures. We have energy-only markets in Alberta and Texas, and then we have regulated markets across both sides. I think, I wouldn't say there's specific lessons in Canada that we can apply in US. I think the first and most important thing is greater cooperation between Canada and the US. In particular, yes, we're talking about trade and tariffs today, but over the course of the coming months, our governments are going to be looking at the USMCA. But as we think about where the world is, a fortress North America, economically and geopolitically, ensuring Arctic security, winning the AI arms race, all of those lead to a more highly developed and integrated Canada and the US. A successful Canada is a successful US, and a successful US is a successful North America. And so for me, that's where I think our focus should be on both sides of the border.
All right, we'll leave it there today, but thank you so much, Avik, for your time and insights, and thank you again to Capital Power for their partnership in making today's summit possible.
Thanks, Callie.
Appreciate it.